today. And this research is basically a collaborative effort with my really wonderful colleagues here, Eszter and Jared. So together we explore how climate change is framed as a security threat in the national security strategies of Australia, the UK, and the US. And we look at the implications for both policy and activism in this space. So climate change, as you know, is increasingly seen as a threat multiplier, shaping national security frameworks worldwide. And recently, the UN Secretary General actually called the global climate crisis as a life and death issue for humanity and emphasized the profound impact it has on both ecosystems and political landscapes. Similarly, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they have repeatedly pointed out that the security risks that are tied to climate change. Since the early 2000s, this understanding has led to the growing securitization of climate policy, especially in countries like the UK, the US, and Australia, where we see more and more that these nations are framing climate change within their national security agendas in quite unprecedented ways. So much of the existing research has focused on defense responses to climate change. So usually looking at how military institutions address climate risks in national security strategies. So what we are trying to do here is to broaden that scope and include civil approaches, such as policies from civilian agencies and government departments focused on the environment and disaster management. By exploring how defense as well as the civil institution collaborate or sometimes operate independently in framing climate change as a security issue, we try to offer a more comprehensive view of national security policies. So the AUKUS partnership is also very relevant in this context because it enhances defense cooperation in the Indo-Pacific region, which is significantly impacted by climate change. So our analysis draws on two key frameworks, securitization theory and world risk society. Don't worry, I will not go into much detail about that, but just to say that these frameworks basically together, they help us to understand how climate change is framed as a security issue, as well as how societies manage the associated environmental risks. So for example, in securitization theory, if you look at that, it shows us that when climate change is framed as a major threat, governments tend to respond with urgent reactive policies, which often focus more on short-term security measures, such as military preparedness and tightening of borders, rather than actually addressing long-term climate solutions. World Risk Society then adds to this by explaining how the fear of future climate disasters lead governments to constantly preempt and manage these future risks, often placing security measures above public participation. So for our methodology, we used corpus-assisted policy analysis, and we combined both qualitative and quantitative approaches. So in the quantitative analysis, we included word frequency, and we looked at keyword analysis. For the qualitative analysis, we did that to complement the quantitative analysis and to understand the context in which these terms are used, so to give us a deeper insight into how climate change is being framed. So the data here consists of basically publicly available government policy and strategy documents from from all the three selected countries. And all of them were analyzed using Sketch Engine, which is a tool for corpus linguistics. And the table here, you can see, basically it shows you the breakdown of the subcorpora of the 3 countries and the policy documents that we had, including the number of the documents and the total word count for the data set, which was about 1.4 million words. So this is the dashboard for Sketch Engine, where you can see the keyword tool, and that helps to determine which words or expressions are typical of a particular text, set of texts, variety, or language variety or discourse. So essentially what it does is it shows us what words stand out compared to the norm. So for this study, we focused on keywords that are statistically significantly overused in relation to our reference corpus. And this is a quick snapshot of the quantitative analysis. We don't have time to fully explore this, so I'm just going to focus on the key nodes over here. Stop slipping, which are highlighted in red. So you can see here that the keywords, specifically, we can see how many times they appear per million words. So for example, in Australia, resilience is mentioned about 2,432 times per million words, which is significantly higher than how the other, compared to some of the other terms. And this is what we really mean by significantly overused words. Okay. Here we, after we selected our keywords, we then used them for contextual analysis. So here you can see that we searched for the term climate and then filtered the results by the node word risk to see how these words travel together in the corpus. And in the case of climate, you can see in this particular example that it is framed in terms of security risk. And you can see that it's all highlighted and underlined in red. So there are things like risk to our national security and resilience, risk posed by regional instability, climate-related risk of violent conflict, etc. For the findings, there are several, but I will only focus on the main narratives here from all the 3 countries. So as you can see, each country frames these issues differently, and I will go over each one of them separately. So in the UK, climate change is framed as a driver of global instability, which calls for international collaboration. So UK's policies focus on the idea that climate risks, and that includes things like resource shortages, migration, geopolitical tensions, and all of these are connected in terms of with global security. And all the key documents, such as the ones that you can see on the slide, actually reflect this focus. And this image here shows you how we use the quantitative analysis, filtering for climate and resilience, to see, to understand the framing in UK. So you can see that the emphasis on terms like strengthening the stability of the international system, extending military relationships, etc., they kind of show the focus on both national resilience and international cooperation to manage the potential risk of global instability due to climate change. Then in Australia, climate change is really framed around regional impacts more than anything else. And there's a very, very strong emphasis on resilience and adaptation. As you can see in the sample analysis, Australia's focus is on helping partner countries adapt to climate change, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. So the strategy here balances adaptation and mitigation. with key investments in things like infrastructure, water, agriculture, and all of these are aimed to build resilience across the entire region. Then we have US, and here climate change is viewed as a constant threat that impacts military readiness and national security. So key policy documents highlight the need for the military to build resilience and adapt to the ongoing challenges which are presented by climate change. And the analysis shows the US's focus on integrating climate resilience into military planning. The armies, you can see here, the army is addressing resilience in resource management, and the Department of Defense is building partnerships to enhance climate security. So in terms of the overall approach of these countries and how they view and frame climate change, we see that the United Kingdom has been a leader in climate change as a security issue. In 2007, it was the first country to bring this issue to the United Nations Security Council. And that was a time when it was a pivotal moment really in global climate discussions, because that was the first time that it was framed as a security threat. So since then, UK's national security strategy has included climate change in its broader risk management framework, recognizing its role in driving geopolitical instability as well as resource conflicts. What sets UK approach apart is its all hazards strategy. It's not just about reducing emissions, it's about building resilience and working with other countries, as mentioned before. So the UK sees climate change as a multi-layered threat, addressing things like resource disputes and migration, and calling for action across different sectors. Australia has, on the other hand, taken a slower, more cautious approach to securitization of climate change. A big reason for this is Australia's economic reliance on fossil fuels and political reluctance to fully address the climate crisis. So even though climate risks do appear in the Defense White Paper, especially in relation to regional security in the Pacific, as we mentioned, Australia's strategy has mostly focused on adaptation and resilience rather than really securitizing climate change as such. But the 2019-2020 bushfires kind of changed public opinion a fair bit, and it increased political pressure to act. So this has led to a gradual shift towards securitizing climate risk, but Australia still remains mostly reactive, and they mostly focus again on regional stability rather than comprehensive climate policy involving proactive long-term solutions. Then we have US, and in US, how much focus is placed on climate change is basically determined by who's in charge. So under the Obama administration, for example, climate change was a key part of the national security strategy, and it was recognized as a threat to military readiness and global stability. Then during Trump administration, this focus shifted towards issues that are more broader, like broader security and economy, etc. Now in the Biden administration, climate change has been elevated again, with an emphasis on a potential increase to geopolitical tensions and disruption to global security. But these shifts from urgency to neglect basically reflect the broader challenges that US has had in maintaining a consistent approach to climate securitization. Surprisingly, this study has limitations. So we focused mainly on military and civil policy documents, but there's a lot more to consider. For example, climate policies in sectors like transportation and health, etc. So this study is also a starting point. Moving forward, we plan to expand it by using large language models to conduct global review. But for that, we need resources. So if anybody here has a pot of money lying around, we'd be more than happy to help you spend it. So just saying. Right, so clearly climate change securitization has implications for activism. So on the positive side, we can say that when governments frame climate change as a national security threat, it tends to get more attention and resources, which can lead to quicker policy actions. But this always comes at a cost, because the framing of climate change as a security issue often limits democratic engagement, making it much harder for activists to organize and protest freely. So the examples on the slide here show how it kind of plays out in practice. In the UK, Just Stop activists received record prison sentences, 21 years collectively, for planning a non-violent protest. Similarly, in Australia, Laura Davey was sentenced to 3 months in jail for participating in a coal terminal protest. And in the US, climate activists from Sunrise Movement were arrested after protesting at the Speaker's office. So these examples highlight how protests are increasingly being treated as threats to public order and national security, with legal consequences becoming more and more severe. Adding to this narrative, several politicians, including Ted Cruz in the US and Nigel Adams in the UK, have labeled climate change activists as eco-terrorists or use similar rhetoric to delegitimize their actions. And the challenge, of course, then is that moving forward, to find a way to balance between, effectively balance how to address climate risks, but also keeping, protecting the rights of protesters and democratic participation. There are also significant policy implications. One of the major issues is how political actors use climate change rhetoric for their own agendas. So, for example, in Australia, we've seen political leaders downplay the urgency of climate change to protect the coal industry, which is key economic driver here. In the US, similarly, there's been focus on prioritizing fossil fuel industries over climate action, which often then results in delayed or ineffective policies that don't really address the real issues. So another critical concern is the rise of extremist groups exploiting climate crisis. So there is increasing connections between climate change and extremist action, which actually Jared will explore further in his presentation. Then, yes, almost done. Then we have eco-fascist groups in the US and the UK who also use climate instability to advance their dangerous ideologies. For example, groups like Patriotic Alternative in the UK have twisted environmental issues to promote anti-immigration policies. Then in US in 2019, El Paso shooter also identified as eco-fascist, and he cited environmental concerns like overpopulation as justification for his violent anti-immigrant attack. And you'll hear more about this and eco-fascists in Eszter's presentation next. And not to be left behind, in Australia, right-wing extremist groups such as the National Socialist Network have also latched on to environmental debates. They use issues like resource limitations to push their white supremacist agendas, arguing that immigration and population growth threaten the country's resources and stability. So really, this demonstrates the need for governments to be prepared for how extremists might take advantage of climate-related crises and ensure they have resilient strategies in place to respond to the emerging threats. And on the last note, and I'm done, finally, the US election, with just around the corner, there's a real concern about a potential of return of Trump administration. So during his last term, Trump not only rolled back key climate policies like pulling out of the Paris Agreement. He also blocked climate research across federal agencies. So if he's reelected again, we could see another wave of anti-climate policies, really, which would set back climate efforts at a time when it is urgently needed. And on that cheerful note, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That was terrific. Next, we have Eszter, who will be delivering a presentation on darkening white countries, mainstreaming climate disinformation in the global north. Off to you, Eszter. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not used to a PC, so I'm just trying to find the presenter view. Oh, sorry.
Got it?
Just go, yeah. No, not that one. I just, okay. Sorry.
I'll bring stuff.
The tech support disappeared from the tools.
It's right there.
Thanks. I'd like the notes. I'd like to see the notes. Presenter view. But yeah. Okay, maybe it's not coming up. That's fine. Oh, thank you. Thanks so much. Okay, hello everyone. So my topic is on climate disinformation in the global north. There has been a lot of research that's been done on the relationship between climate change and violent extremism, especially in the global south. If we think about Middle Eastern countries, the spread of ISIS and how they use things like hydroterrorism, for example, but there's a lot less research on this topic in the global north. So in my topic, I'll just very quickly introduce my research project and the context. And I'll show you how eco-fascist grievances are constructed in the online space, how eco-fascists are offering solutions to the climate crisis, and then offer, especially to the practitioners in the room, some recommendations about building resiliency to eco-fascist radicalization. So why did I become interested in this topic now? So the climate action movement in general tends to be associated with green liberal environmentalist movements and more broadly left-wing political ideologies. Younger generations are especially sensitized to this issue and tend to show positive attitudes towards climate activism. If you think about recent demonstrations, Fridays for Future, Rise for Climate, for example, these were joined by millions of people around the world. However, concern for the environment and warnings about the imminent climate crisis are gaining traction within far and extreme right and white supremacist movements. So while the far right is polarized and remains polarized about climate change, and skeptics dismiss climate science as climate change hysteria, they tend to be hostile against climate policies. This is not the case for some far-right and extreme-right organizations on a global scale. Environmental activism, as you can see on these images, is becoming more and more popular among far-right groups. They collect waste from public places. They organize hiking tracks in forests and the mountains. They advocate a vegan or a vegetarian diet. So it's definitely spreading online. Sometimes these sentiments spill into terrorist violence. I'm sure most of you know about these terrorist attacks, started with the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. So Richard Spencer has kind of disappeared now from the space, but in his manifesto, he talks about nature and being his steward or his destroyer. So since these terrorist attacks, both scholarly and mainstream media interest in eco-fascism have increased significantly. And if you think about recent media articles, they have also reported on the rise of eco-fascist sentiments and this rhetoric entering current political discourses. So just a few key concepts and definitions. So the concept of eco-fascism has several working definitions, but essentially they convey similar ideas. I place it as a distinct phenomenon under what Balsa Lubarda calls far-right ecologisms, which he defines as any attempt to address the fundamental causes of environmental change through holistic, ideological, or value-based underpinnings. It's also been defined as the pre-appropriation of authentically fascist movements with environmentalist concerns. Or Christy Campion more recently defined it as a reactionary and revolutionary ideology that champions the regeneration of an imagined community through a return to a romanticized ethno-pluralist vision of the natural order. White supremacist environmentalism isn't a new phenomenon. The idea that nature and land are one with the people can be found already in the 19th century. The term ecology was coined by Haeckel in 1867. He was a German ecologist, essentially paved the way for the Green Wing of the Nazi Party in the 30s. It can also be traced back to the German Völkisch movement. Then if you think about the American alt-right, the precursor to eco-fascist ideation on the American alt-right can be traced back to the idea of the white man and the frontier, the idea of the wilderness as an empty space, as if indigenous peoples have never lived there, never existed. President Grant's conservation and national parks movement unfortunately have eugenistic undertones and John Cray's science underpinnings. Think about the Malthusian fixation with third world population growth. And then, of course, you all know the Nazi slogan, blood and soil, that relates to this idea of purity of land equals the purity of nature. So this idea of protecting the purity of land and nature was equated with protecting national identity and racial purity. So my study is this study on eco-fascism is part of a larger project that focused on far-right radicalization and extremism and investigated radicalization strategies in online far-right propaganda and disinformation campaigns. And I conducted forensic linguistic analysis of far and extreme right websites and manifestos. You might have heard of forensic linguistics in relation to Ted Kaczynski, who's also better known as the Unabomber in the United States. So he was put behind bars with the help of forensic linguistics by James Fitzgerald, FBI special agent. So essentially, forensic linguistics is the study of language as evidence. So investigating evidence of hate speech, discrimination, propaganda, criminogenic intent specifically. And many other topics. Today, I'm zooming in specifically on the construction of eco-fascist discourses. I use a multidisciplinary methodology, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to show you what tools I use for the coding. I use the concept of appraisal signature coined by a forensic linguist called Dr. Roni Ataiwe, who's based in Darwin, and the concept of affiliation, a group affiliation, and I use corpus linguistics for collecting data, storage, and processing to conduct a quantitative analysis. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the system network one by one, but I wanted to show you that I examine what choices are made from the linguistic system of appraisal. So these are resources that map the linguistic resources of evaluation. So there are many more options available for users in any context than offered by what some of you might know as sentiment analysis. Sentiment analysis contains resources that tiny little system of affect, emotions, feelings, that's pretty much it. There's so many more choices that users have. So if you think about resources for persuasion, users choose from the system of engagement. Attitude can be measured in terms of not only emotions and feelings, but also judgments and evaluations. And then resources for grading force or grading for forces have to do with amplification or turning the volume up or down, for example. So I use this kind of coding to explore how an eco-fascist ideology is built up in far-right and extreme-right websites and manifestos. All these examples are from the manifesto of the Nordic resistance movement, and I will demonstrate some of these through the data. It will make probably a lot more sense. The one point I do want to make here is that the coding of the data is rigorous and systemic. Linguistic analysis is not supposed to be subjective or based on personal interpretation. The data that I collected are from publicly available far and extreme right websites and manifestos. This was harvested and stored using the corpus linguistic software sketch engine that Saira showed you earlier. The corpus is made up of several subcorpora of several Hungarian far-right and white supremacist websites, English language subcorpus of materials by the Nordic resistance movement, manifesto, and the websites of the American alt-right, and then also lone wolf manifestos, and it totals more than 11 million words. You might ask what's the relationship between the Hungarian extreme right and the American alt-right and the Nordic resistance movement. These seemingly separate extreme right spaces are linked by sharing the idea of a shared white common homeland. So for example, the Nordic resistance movement wants a pan-European, pan-Nordic ethno-state, white ethno-state. The Hungarian Our Homeland movement wants white civilization from what they say from Reykjavik to Kamchatka. They have a nostalgia for a lost and better past. They have a fascination with neo-paganism. So for example, the Nordic resistance movement and the American alt-right draw heavily on Norse and Viking mythology, whereas the Hungarian extreme right draws heavily on Panturanism, and also commemorations of Nazi historical events, for example, Day of Honor marches regularly held in Budapest, Hungary, that attract the transnational extreme right every year. So again, Saira showed this software dashboard to you before, so I'm not going to talk about it. I'm just going to go straight to the quantitative findings in my data set. So basically, the main topics that each of these online spaces are concerned with are immigration, the environment, and Jews and Zionism. For the alt-right, it's the second most important, the third most important topic, and for the Europeans, it's the second most important cluster that I found in the data set. So I'm just going to show you one case study, results from one case study by the Nordic resistance movement. This is the largest, most active, and most violent militant neo-Nazi group that operates across the Nordic countries. It has active chapters in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. Its website is available in all of the Nordic languages, as well as English and Russian. They openly praise Hitler and Codreanu and draw heavily on Norse mythology. So if I want to examine their concern for the environment, I can search for it directly in the software, and then I can zoom in on the actual code text and see what kind of context it appears in. So here on the slide, you can see, so I'm going to actually zoom in on the qualitative results here. You see how in this extract, for example, they link multiculturalism and mass immigration to environmental degradation. They say things like no true environmental party can support multiculturalism, as this genocidal ideology constitutes the polar opposite of biological diversity and evolutionary progress. So they talk a lot about mass immigration, multiculturalism, linking it to invasions of foreign species, and basically destroying the environment. So if I want to trace specifically the term multiculturalism and mass immigration using Sketch Engine, I can search for it and then see how it's mentioned and how it's evaluated. So they basically say that multiculturalism is responsible for environmental degradation. And the point to make here is that a message doesn't mean anything if there's no user. So we're interested in the uptake by the user. A user can rally around, reject, ignore, or defer a social bond. And then if we look at the example with mass immigration, again, if we look at how it's evaluated in the text, you see how they talk about it as the most alarming and urgent threat, genocide, etc. So they claim the message is that mass immigration leads to the extension of the white Nordic race. So this repeated pattern of coupling negative evaluation with the grievances of multiculturalism and immigration is what creates these bonds, these social bonds in the text. So these repeated patterns can be generalized and formalized. So looking at the most salient linguistic resources, so you get these negatively charged social bonds. So if we lose the evaluation and we go outside of this text to other texts online, on any other articles or social media, if an eco-fascist looks at the term multiculturalism, the negative evaluation has already been established through intertextuality. So this social bond is there for them to affiliate with. So where does it fit into the ideology? So what matters is the relationship between the ideas. What bond network is an idea part of? So you see here that the major clusters are global Zionism and environmental degradation. And in this text, it's actually environmental degradation. That's the second largest cluster. So to sort of summarize the linguistic fingerprint of eco-fascist rhetoric, they brand non-white populations as invading foreigners or parasites. Local minorities are constructed as foreign species who are responsible for environmental degradation, and therefore the homeland needs protecting from them. They are also typically clustered together with old Nazi tropes and familiar white supremacist grievances like immigration, multiculturalism, liberalism, cultural Marxism, the ones you're familiar with, constructed as violations of the natural order and exploitation of natural resources and contributing to white genocide. Of course, they also offer solutions to climate change. So what about the implications of these eco-fascist ideas? Again, if we look at their solutions, it ranges from stopping immigration to advocating genocide. So they say things like, we should clear populations, we should remove these populations from our living spaces. Language isn't the only thing that creates these social bonds in this propaganda. If you look at these posters from White Extinction Rebellion, which is sort of like a counter group to Extinction Rebellion, you see how they use images to construct people as trash. If you look at the color semiotics use of white and green, white used as construction for the white race, green as our green homeland, so it reinforces the language of the websites and the manifestos. The logo of the NRM is also white and green. And then you see the copy of the old SS uniform, the brown uniform, the red bold capital font of eco-fascism. So it all visually resurrects the Nazi blood and soul slogan. So it's an important question to ask, when can this language and these memes incite violence? So if you think, the Christchurch shooter, he's concerned about saving the environment. In order to do that, you have to kill immigrants and invaders. So I traced the word kill in his manifesto. It occurs exactly 48 times. So you see his targets: kill the overpopulation, kill high-profile politicians like Angela Merkel, Erdogan, etc., etc. So what does it mean for policy and preventing violent extremism? So we've seen more and more frequent calls for violence against non-white populations, minorities, and refugees who are blamed for the climate crisis. During the COVID-19 pandemic, these extreme right groups were celebrating deaths in the global south, so that would help us with overpopulation. And they are preparing for a fight for scarce resources, so calling for eco-nationalist white ethno-states. Vulnerable youth, so young people who haven't developed enough critical digital literacy and media skills and critical thinking, and who are already sensitized to the climate crisis, are an especially vulnerable target group to radicalize by these groups. So also these ideas are moving into the political mainstream. So Marine Le Pen, for example, in France, have talked about immigrants as nomads who have no roots. Only the French people have roots. And Hungarian Our Homeland movement consider themselves the only true environmental party in the country. So in terms of recommendations for preventing violent extremism, so I submitted these to the ICCT in The Hague. Most PV programs aim to prevent radicalization by equipping people with critical thinking skills, for example, but often they tend to background the focus on how radicalization strategies are communicated through language. So embedding critical digital and media literacies need to be integrated into school curricula from an early age. And Australia is unfortunately very much lagging behind this space compared to places like the Netherlands and Finland. We have to focus on local community building, and Saira said, government tend to have reactive approaches focused on the short-term knee-jerk reactions when something happens. So long-term investment is needed in local community building programs. And lastly, monitoring and interdisciplinary research, so monitoring the evolution of these discourses and their mainstreaming, and whether these proposed solutions invoke eugenics and junk race science, purity discourses, and genocidal thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Eszter. For our last presentation today, we have Dmello, who's going to be delivering a presentation exploring the spatial relationship between climate change and terrorist activity, an empirical framework for policymakers and practitioners.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm very aware that I am the last person standing between you and happy hour, so we're going to make this nice and quick. I just want to acknowledge my collaborator, Christine Neudecker, who can't be here with us today, but she was instrumental in this study. So we're going to take this in a different direction. We're going to focus more on the quantitative analyses, but you might be asking, we know about India, but why India in this context? India is a parliamentary system, so we were very interested in how that can sort of connect with other countries. But of course, the Hindu-Muslim divide in India is well documented. The violence in India is well documented. And frankly, there's high levels of terrorist activity in India, which is always good when we have more data to make this a nice case study. Some things to keep in mind, though, that we found quite interesting is this resurgence of the far rights in India, specifically under the Modi administration, which makes for very interesting case studies as we think about the far right and far right extremism, even when we think about how we could contextualize this here for Australia. But also, it's beyond the time frame of the study, but things that I sort of have on my mind is India is also dealing with an image problem with, I'm sure many of you have seen, Canada expelling the Indian diplomats over the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar. And of course, here in Australia, India's very, very, very bad attempt at spy rings in the country, where Australia is very good at finding and removing them. So when we think of collective violence, India is across the spectrum. When we think of terrorism, when we think of protests, when we think of hate crimes and organized crimes, there's all sorts of violence happening, which again made it a very interesting topic for us to explore. Now, if we think of the climate change section, my colleagues have sort of talked a lot about why climate change is important, but I like to show this graphic, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States made these projection maps that show how our world is going to change as time progresses. And you'll notice we're about halfway through this time period on the left. What we're seeing is climate change is a global issue. And I think, especially here in Australia, we're in a really interesting space where we as a country have prioritized climate change, as has New Zealand, but other countries really haven't. And we're reaching a point where, based off these maps, everyone needs to come together for a global effort. So again, just to drive the point home, the United States even said that at the highest levels of the military, we need to be thinking about climate change as a military problem. We need to be thinking about this across sectors. And really, climate change needs to be integral to the national security framework. So this current study is the first in a series of papers that Christine and I are working on. And the underlying question is, how does climate change impact terrorist activity? This is a very descriptive project, and we really just wanted to sort of map this to get the conversation going. Data comes from two bits. The terrorism component is being pulled from the Global Terrorism Database. Not the best in terms of data efforts, but it was the most comprehensive that had data on latitude and longitude to help us with our study. The climate change component comes from NOAA. It was quite interesting. We tried to find data from specific countries, and it turns out that the United States had the best data for most of these countries. We did run into a problem of the countries that had really good climate change data did not have a lot of really good data on terrorism down to latitude, longitude, and vice versa. So we were lucky that India sort of coalesced in that space. Now, there's quite a lot involved with methods. So instead of just listing it off, I'm going to just sort of walk through and integrate it with our results a little bit. First, what we did is we mapped all of the weather stations in India with our little thermometer. And every green dot, which I'm realizing is very difficult to see at this moment, represents a different terrorist attack that occurred somewhere in the country. We then went through and we documented the temperature, as we can see here. And what we found is for every single month, there is a statistically significant increase in climates. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are saying, why did you need to do t-tests for every single month? And fun story, this is perhaps one of my favorite graphics I've ever made, because early on in this project, we were talking with governmental partners across the United States and academics. And I kid you not, every single person I presented this to looked at me and very seriously said, but how do we know that climate change is actually occurring? And so Christine and I said, well, the data in us, the data scientists in us are going to have a nice t-test so we can use our significance and our stars to show you that climate change is occurring. So once we proved climate change was occurring, we were then able to map these terrorist incidents onto the weather stations based off of extremism. So these are the 12 months, January starting at the top left and December on the bottom right. And in essence, for this analysis, what we're showing is where are there significant connections between areas that had extreme weather variations, which is the term that we had to use under the Trump administration because climate change was a no-no term. And where is the terrorist activity occurring in that space? And so what we saw is for all months, as time progressed specifically, there's this push towards more terrorist activity closer to coastal areas. And then finally, we added our climatological factors and we were able to then assess the risk. So this graphic shows the data just for the month of November. I'll give you a QR code at the end if you want to take a look at all of the data and some of the appendices that we had. So we were looking at 4 climatological factors. We identified from the literature, I believe 8 that are really prevalent, but these are the 4 that data was uniformly available for the full time period. And what we're seeing here is the pink color represents extreme areas. So the pink are areas that had significant differences in climate change. And blue are areas that didn't. And then our greens are areas that had these unusually high levels of extremist activity. Precipitation is our next category, so rainfall. We then looked at elevation. And then the very colorful one is distance to the equator, which of course would be constant throughout the year. So ultimately, our key findings were that as time progressed, extremist groups were really forced to change their space and change their places to these more temperate areas. So this is the raster for November. And what we're seeing is a high level of activity off to India's eastern levels, as well as a proclivity for future violence in the south. And this is particularly important because whenever I talk about sort of the move towards coastal regions, I think of us here where so many of our cities are tied to the coast and the water supplies. So I think that this is really important as we think of other countries of what this could look like if these similar trends happen in other geographic locations. In terms of the implications, I think that this is really interesting research because there is this global interest in climate security right now. And as I mentioned, it's because it really affects all of us in all walks of life. This paper I thought was quite intriguing to me. For some reason, really got picked up by a lot of different news outlets. So there are 80 different news sources across the world, which is shown in the map here. But it turns out that there was an inverse relationship between countries that wanted to talk about the paper and governments that were interested in talking to us about the research underlying the paper. which I thought was quite interesting. But I think what's important here is that there really are these critical conversations that are happening. And I didn't even realize that until I came to the symposium and we were having conversations. So not to call you out, Billy, but Billy and I were having a really interesting chat the other day about the South Australian Premier's office and how do we conceptualize climate and climate security within the broader framework. And these discussions of should climate change be its own priority for Australia and for our states, or should they be integrated in other spaces? And so yesterday, several of the presentations talked about this, where, you know, there's competing interests of mental health, domestic violence, things like that. And we know that climate change is connected to that, or climate more broadly, right? Domestic violence levels, people are inside their houses more for part of the year, things like that. But we really do need to think about this in the context of extremism as well. And to Noemi's point, in her sort of posit to us in the keynote yesterday about place being a real driver, something that I've been thinking about is that we do need to think about the temporality of this. So does this force shift in place create an environment ripe for violence? So ultimately, is the place important because of the climate change? Or is this creating a space where now there's more extremist actors in closer connection with general populations, making it more likely that we're going to see violence occur in the future? So I don't think I'm disagreeing with Noemi, but I'm definitely adding a new potential thoughts for consideration for everyone here today. If you're interested in the full paper, there is a lot of very technical analysis and all of the details for the different GIS steps. So feel free to have a look. It is open access, so you don't need any paywalls or things like that. So feel free to have a look. And if you'd like to have follow-up conversations, I'd be more than happy to have those with you. Thank you so much. And I look